Κυρίες και κύριοι, κύριε Πρόεδρε, κύριοι Πρόεδροι, φίλες και φίλοι, καλησπέρα σας. Θα μου επιτρέψετε να γυρίσω στα αγγλικά. On behalf of the American Hellenic Chamber of Commerce and me personally, I extend a warm welcome to you at tonight's dinner as part of the first two-day agenda of the 34th Greek Economic Summit. GES 2023 has stood once again as the landmark event for economic and business discussions in the country, as it has for over 3 decades. GES has proven to be more significant and relevant than ever, considering the substantial shifts in the global economic and geopolitical landscape over the past few months, coupled with numerous changes and upheavals here at our home. And it once again served as the ideal platform for a comprehensive and objective overview of the economic and investment map on a global scale. Dear friends, it is a great honor for me to address you tonight as we extend a warm welcome to our distinguished guest of honor, the newly elected leader of the main opposition, Mr. Stefanos Kasselakis. His presence here this evening symbolizes the spirit of unity and cooperation that transcends political boundaries and ethos that our chamber has upheld for nearly a century. As we commemorate the achievements of this conference, it is crucial to reflect on the fundamental values that bind us together, values that go beyond party lines and political beliefs. At the American Hellenic Chamber of Commerce, we strongly support that genuine progress and prosperity flourish best through cooperation. Whether it involves collaboration between private enterprises or public-private partnerships, we recognize that collaboration is the key. Hence, in our almost 100 years of operation, we take pride in standing alongside every government and every opposition, recognizing that the challenges confronting our nation demand a united front where dialogue and cooperation supersede divisions, and the robustness of our democracy rests in our polyphony, diversity of ideas, and above all, our capacity to discover common ground for the greater good. Ladies and gentlemen, with this sentiment, I express my gratitude for your participation in yet another successful Greek Economic Summit and for the honor of being part of this evening. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I invite to the podium Mr. Kasselakis for his speech.
Thank you all for being here. Kalispera. In the US, we usually have dinner around 7 p.m. In Greece, around 11 p.m., so here we're right on the middle. Allow me to start by honoring the 91-year-long history of the American Hellenic Chamber of Commerce, an organization that I feel very familiar with, firstly because in many ways it symbolizes my lived experience, my career, but also because in my business career I have exhibited with the Chamber in the US Pavilion during the Posidonia exhibitions in the past. So I'm very familiar with this great organization that has a history full of contribution to the enhancement of Greek-American commercial and trade relations. I'm also glad to address people who are economically active in both Greece and the United States. As you may recall, Syriza was very active itself as a governing party in enhancing US and Greek relations. In 2015, when Syriza was called to govern, Greek exports to the United States were limited to approximately 1.4 billion US dollars. 3 years later, and despite the great deflationary pressures in the Greek economy, while our country was exiting a downward spiral of austerity, our exports to the United States increased to $1.6 billion. Last year, in 2022, we've gone up to $2.3 billion. According to the United Nations Comtrade database on international trade, the driving forces of these exports are mineral fuels, oils, distillation products, vegetables, fruits, nuts, food preparations, electronics, electrical equipment, aluminum, salt, sulfur, stone, plaster, lime, and cement. And according to the same source, US exports to Greece reached 2.1 billion USD in 2022, with mineral fuels, oils, and distillation products fostering the growth. From 2011 to 2022, the US was the 8th largest source of foreign direct investment in Greece. In 2021, American FDI reached $303 million. These figures look good. The growth is encouraging. And it definitely points to positive prospects for a further increase in the foreseeable future. But other figures, unfortunately, are more alarming because they portray imbalances and mainly strategic differences in tackling the fiscal crisis that the two countries, in the case of Greece, particularly have experienced. And in Greece, unlike the United States, what we've experienced has been a heavy burden on the backs of the majority of our fellow citizens. Therefore, I would like to talk to you today about some macro, and then after that, I will bring it together with a political argument on the macro picture. First, about the Greek and United States, the Greek and American fiscal policy, and the comparison between the two. The United States dared to go to average primary deficits of 4.6% between 2010 and 2014, and 1.5% primary deficit between 2015 and 2019, about the same levels as Japan and Britain, while bringing growth. In Greece, after a 25% drop in our GDP between 2010 and 2014, the country was struggling to return to growth, was struggling to break even. The EU, ECB, and IMF Troika imposed an average primary surplus of 2.7% in 2015 to 2019. Why? Because we experienced a very big failure between 2010 and 2014. In our country, we experienced a great experiment of internal devaluation, one that was unprecedented in history. And the entire burden of a country in default, technical default, fell on the government of Alexis Tsipras after the unprecedented concessions of the previous government coalition between New Democracy and PASOK. For context, when the Troika pushed for surpluses between 2010 and 2014, the first memoranda, you may recall, the country was sinking with deficits of 4.2% and an unprecedented average annual investment decline of 14%, while the US was growing those years. This is after the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. The US was growing its investment by 4%. Greece was collapsing by 14%. In the US, between 2010 and 2014, we saw average real wage growth of 0.5%, about as much as the Eurozone, 0.3%. Greece suffered losses of 4.6% a year, every year, until the citizens were exhausted, until demand simply plunged. You may recall that period. There was sluggish growth and anxiety globally, but at least there was a muddling through in the United States and in the Eurozone. In Greece, as you may recall, we experienced a disaster. In that period, the US brought in public investment at an average of 3.6% each year, which was, by the way, above the Eurozone. In Greece, we had 3.2%, which, ironically, was there to support the 14% of investment we were losing, barely enough. So all these GDP figures were ultimately normalized under the Syriza government. In the PASOK government, 2009 to 11, and the coalition government, 11-15, the administrations were simply bad students of a major fiscal adjustment that destroyed the country's foundation and simply did not work. The sequencing of product market and labor market reforms was simply wrong, and it punished the Greek population. The goals were never reached in the downhill of those years, and when Syriza took over, it set out to finally get the country out of that downward spiral. And it succeeded. It succeeded with an unprecedented debt negotiation, debt settlement negotiation, one that is extolled by bankers and rating agencies and government officials worldwide, to date, still extolled. Let's talk a little bit about the situation in Greece today. Sadly, the Greek government seems to have learned nothing from what happened to the country. With the recipes that we lived in during those dark times, it voluntarily imposes austerity until at least 2026. This is a K-type growth with the funds of the Recovery and Resilience Fund, the RRF, going to a few and bringing weak growth at the expense of the many. We will experience fiscal tightening that is already bringing taxes to GDP to a 25-year record with no prospect of reduction. And it's interesting why 2026. Why this fiscal tightening over the coming 3 years voluntarily? Think about it. There's only one reason, so that once again they can proceed with their subsidies and their food stamps in 2027, an election year. Sometimes I wonder, and forgive my plain English, how stupid do they think we are? This is very simplistic. Just execute the right fiscal policy for the people. Don't punish them today so they're dependent on you then. That is how you respect the people. Greece has agreed to the second largest fiscal discipline in the EU, with primary surpluses covering 7.5% of GDP in the coming 5-year period, starting 21 on to 26. Frugal states like Germany and the Netherlands, as well as powerful France, who, by the way, voted in favor of a ceasefire for the Palestinian people, unlike our country. Let's note that. Those nations have committed to relax targets to recover from the cost of living crisis. They all experienced a cost of living crisis. France, with a debt of 111% of GDP, gets to a much better package of fiscal targets, ranging between a primary deficit of 3% and a primary deficit of 1.6% over the coming 3 years. And Spain, with a similar debt level, with a primary deficit of 1.5% for this year, going up to essentially flat in 2025. Ms. Meloni in Italy, a friend and political companion of Mr. Mitsotakis, has retreated from what she had announced before the election and is setting austerity targets with a final primary surplus of 2% all the way out in 2026. We will never really know about the country's demands, sadly, our country's demands, regarding the reform of the Stability Pact. And mind you, we are the country with the highest debt and weakest growth combination in Europe. In fact, we are 14th in terms of real GDP growth over the past 3 years, 2019, 2022. We, Greece, we are the country most in need of relaxing the Stability Pact. But our government does not negotiate and does not claim our rights. The proposal of the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, which is frugal, was very favorable on the debt side to get down to 100%, with an annual primary surplus of 1/20th of the remaining 100% of the debt. The proposal of the European Fiscal Board was to reduce our debt by 10% over 15 years. This amounts to 2.4 billion euro a year, or something like 1 to 1.5% of GDP in primary surplus. This was not used as a bargaining chip. Let's talk a little bit about the current account balance, exports, imports. We're in a country that relies heavily, about 1/5 of its economy, on tourism. You might therefore assume that Greece should be a powerhouse in terms of our current accounts. Well, listen to this. The 2015-2019 average for Greece was a current account deficit of 2.1%, and the current account deficit in the US at the same time was 2.3%, similar. In 2022, our difference went to 7 points with the US. We ended up recording a current account deficit of 11%, 10.6% of GDP to be precise, while the US had 3.8% of a current account deficit. It's a drastic difference between the two countries. This is a unique productive compass deficit in Europe, in a country that reached 20% trade deficit as part of its GDP, with a 20-year record. All of this in the past year. You might say that this is because of the high fuel prices. Well, you'll be wrong again. The non-oil, excluding oil, trade balance reached a deficit of 13.5% in 2022, which is a record, since 2008. Again, excluding fuel, our current account deficit reached a record last year that we hadn't reached since 2008. So what's happened? What is the structural difference? Simply put, Mr. Mitsotakis' Greece imports what it consumes, and it does not produce enough. All this money of the pandemic fiscal easing was thrown, sadly, into a bottomless barrel. Maybe won elections, but it doesn't change the reality of the day. And the result can be seen in the Commission's estimates, the European Commission's estimates, that in 2025, Greece will proceed with 7%, 6%, and 6% deficits, current account deficits, when Europe as a whole will have a surplus of 2%. Once again, our manufacturing machine, our export orientation, despite tourism, lagging dramatically. And this is part of a bigger picture. This is part of our divergence from Europe, despite our goals for convergence. So let's talk a little bit about the convergence. We have a very, very long way to go. Under the Mitsotakis government, the country took many steps back. We say convergence everywhere, with all the crucial figures that will stimulate the working classes and a large social majority. Convergence everywhere with Europe in the medium term. Greece lags behind in terms of growth. Investment-wise, Greece is last in the European Union in terms of investment to GDP as a ratio. We're literally last in the European Union in terms of investment, with 13.7% of our GDP. It's a deviation of almost 9% to the rest of the EU. We're behind by 18 billion euro on that metric. Greece is last with 7.4% of GDP when the EU average is 14% in terms of private investment. In terms of exports of goods and services, we have a deviation of 6% from the Eurozone and 7.2% from the EU. We're 15 billion behind. In terms of wages and salaries, Greece has a 10.2% of GDP deviation, 20 billion euro behind in terms of wages and salaries from the EU average. This is massive, absolutely massive. With our income, in real terms, we buy 68% of the volume of the same items compared to the average European. 68% below the average. We're placed 24th out of 27 in the EU. 24th. 32% away from the EU average. Listen to this. You may recall Ireland as a problematic economy back in the day. Well, we are 193% behind Ireland in terms of our buying power today. As if this were not enough, our country is third in the European Union in the rate of workplace bullying, the so-called mobbing. This is the type of workplace environment that damages the personality, the dignity, or physical or mental integrity of employees, endangers their work, or disrupts their working climate. So think about it. Low wages, terrible working environment. These are facts. This is not a serious opposition. This is European Union facts. In the figures of the general government, health expenditure We have a negative deviation of 1.5% of GDP. We're at 6.7% versus 8.2% for the Eurozone. We're 3 billion euro behind in terms of healthcare. Education. We're 0.7% of GDP behind versus the EU. 1.25, 1.25 billion is needed for convergence. Family and child expenditure. We're almost 1% behind from the EU. 1.6 billion needed for convergence. Expenditure on sickness and disability. 1.3% of GDP behind from the EU average. 2.7 billion needed for convergence. Greece is at the absolute bottom of the EU in terms of housing policy. It allocates much less than 1% of GDP for this purpose, while Austria, Denmark, Germany allocate 2% of GDP. Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Ireland, 1% of GDP. You may not know this, but Greece is one of the few EU countries that does not even have social housing. Disposable income. We're behind by 2.1% of GDP compared to the EU average. Surcharges. We have 1.5% of GDP more value-added tax than the EU average, and 1.7% more than the Eurozone. And of course, when it comes to taxes on capital, we're at 0.1% of GDP, which is 1/3 of the burden of the rest of the Eurozone. So again, taxes on capital, we're 3 times as easy on that. Value-added tax, we're 1.5% of GDP more than the EU average. And then all the other social metrics, we're way behind. Is this a success story? Based on what facts is this a success story? It's not. The Greek people know it. And the opposition parties, and especially the main opposition party, Syriza, has a huge obligation to society to communicate an alternative, realistic, economic and social proposal so that this convergence can be real and lasting. Why do I make so many comparisons between Greece and the United States? It's to demonstrate, in the language of numbers, the catastrophic national and social consequences of the harsh, restrictive austerity policies implemented by the conservative governments in Greece and Europe, as opposed to the expansionary fiscal policies that we saw implemented by the Biden administration as a recipe for a way out of the crisis with growth-igniting prospects. Some ill-intended people deliberately misunderstand or even distort my references to the US Democratic Party. Perhaps as they try to portray me as somebody who's trying to turn Syriza into a centrist or even center-right party. I know very well which party I am serving as its president. And when I say that the model of the US Democratic Party is one that offers some good examples for us, I mean a party that is a big tent, pluralistic party that can help us grow, that can help us keep the governing left, in which forces from the progressive, reform-oriented left actively participate alongside a progressive center. And we must ensure that this breadth of participation continues to exist and to open up space for all these forces to cooperate and to produce a programmatic synthesis of progressive, efficient governance for our country. This is a program that will be aligned with the economic and social needs of our times. Economic and social needs of our times. It will provide answers to the big contemporary questions, the big questions of the era. You may know we have a lot to tackle with artificial intelligence and the future of work, transitioning to green technologies alongside new and major geopolitical challenges. In this complex mission that we have before us as the main opposition party, we also examined very important progressive policies. These were put to bills by the US Democrats under pressure from the Progressive Caucus in their parliamentary group. Again, the US Democratic Party, with its Progressive Caucus, has passed a list of very impressive and in some ways very left reforms and packages. The Student Loan Forgiveness Act, although the Supreme Court struck down the bill, a way has been found to cover nearly $50 billion of loans for students in need of support. The package of direct state subsidies, the stimulus checks, to the most vulnerable families to address the economic impact of the pandemic. Previously, under the Obama administration, $11 billion was earmarked to support health centers, mostly in the most economically vulnerable areas of the United States. And this was under the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. The Republicans blasted it, repeal and replace, repeal and replace. They had their chance to repeal and replace it. They had nothing to replace it with, and they didn't even dare to repeal it. That was leadership at the time from the Democratic Party. They increased the minimum wage to $15 per hour. Guess what? Even Amazon was forced to accept that. The current debate on safeguarding union rights at a time when in the US, mainly thanks to the great successes of unions in raising wages in the automobile industry, public confidence in unions is actually at record levels. These are just few examples of good practices of progressive policy that move both the economy and society forward. Because for us, there can be no solid, sustainable, and long-term growth if it does not go hand in hand with social progress. And what do we want to do in this direction here in Greece as Syriza? We want to build a healthy labor market with wages and rights that will allow a decent living and will not drive young Greeks abroad. I know too many of them. I've been one myself at a time in my life. We need to create a simple, clear, and stable tax framework. A tax code that will last a decade, that will not change every quarter as we do now, as we see now. With a progressive corporate tax rate. And without advance payment of business income. This stuff is like so backwards in Greece. You prepay your business income, and then you try to be competitive in a country where the banking sector barely provides loans for small businesses. We need to reallocate the resources of the RRF to small and medium-sized enterprises. These are the backbone of the Greek economy. We should not demonize them. We should not try to close them, as the current government is essentially doing. Instead, we should try to empower them. We should try to empower them. They don't have access to bank lending. They are literally suffocating with debt. We need to help them and empower them. Without small businesses of 5 to 15 employees that generate added value from the productive sector, from manufacturing and services, there can never be stability. Let us implement a just and inclusive green transition that will not leave behind thousands of helpless unemployed citizens. We can do both. Let us design a big program for the huge, huge social problem, the social issue of housing, for independent living and emancipation of the young people, so that demographic indicators can gradually improve. This is a national predicament. We must tackle it now. We need big government to solve this big problem. Big, efficient government to solve this problem from generations to come. We want to emphasize adequate funding for extroversion of education and scientific research. We want to attract foreign direct investments that will generate added value for the national economy and that they will not be limited to the import of products. Also, FDI that is not simply real estate. Real estate is good, but it's very, very temporary. We need real FDI in our country. We need to restore the rule of law and to ensure the proper functioning of the state in a transparent manner, emphasizing real digitalization of its services rather than the creation of additional digital bureaucracy. Are you aware that we're at the last place in the European Union in terms of our justice system? This is one of the main three factors that foreign entrepreneurs, foreign investors look at in investing in a foreign jurisdiction. 4.5 years on, the Mitsotakis government has essentially done nothing so that the justice system can work properly. Still says we have a long way to go there and we are reform-oriented. Well, I'm very sorry, but the way they've treated the independent authority and the privacy of data and communications points to the exact opposite direction. Rest assured that leaders, business leaders in the US are fully aware of the rule of law issues that this country has, including at the highest level of the courts. And they will not just hand out their investment if they don't trust the justice system in Greece. We need to pursue an active, multidimensional foreign policy by taking advantage of the country's critical geopolitical position, building bridges with East and West to attract bilateral and multilateral win-win partnerships in the Balkans and the southeastern Mediterranean. All of this is the basic philosophy on which we will structure our party's new strategy, and it will be a very groundbreaking program for the progressive governance of our country. Progressive governance with transparency and efficiency. And in this course, we're looking for allies and companions among the brightest minds of Greece, to those who foster pioneering ideas for the common good, to those who want to see their country move forward, to change for the better. These people and these minds, wherever they live today around the world, are the future. They are the explosive catalyst for the transformation of Greece, so that Greece can become a country worth living, educating, working, doing business, innovating, raising your children. And I stand before you pledging exactly that for Greece. This is what I have dubbed the Greek dream. We deserve to have one. We can have one. That's the one that I'm fighting for and that I will continue to fight for. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, I'll end my speech, and thank you for your patience, with a small reference to my own experience in the Greek diaspora in the United States. When I decided to run for the presidency of Syriza, I was criticized I was criticized by many precisely because I came from the Greek diaspora, from the expat community, without previous political experience here in Greece, and without even speaking perfect Greek. I was judged for my origins, for my professional career, and for my intentions. I was judged by people who frankly know almost nothing about the Greek diaspora. People who lump all expatriate Greeks, and especially expatriates from the US, as backward-thinking and extreme conservative people. I know, and you know, that is not the case. The love that expats and diaspora have for their homeland is neither conservatism nor regression. It hides within it an unquenchable need for reconnection, and above all, an unquenchable thirst, interest, and anxiety for a prosperous future for this country. A prosperous future for their homeland, even if they live thousands of miles away. I have known this community since I was 14 years old. And with this diaspora, I want to be constantly in communication from now on, because together we can ensure the common good of Greeks. You here, you are the voice in the United States. You're our voice. At the same time, you are a bridge between Greece and the United States. And you have a very important role to play in strengthening bilateral cooperation, and especially in strengthening Greece's extroversion vis-à-vis the US, in terms of trade and the economy, with agri-food exports, tourism, research and technology, shipping, cultural exchanges, and other sectors. To refer to current affairs, we need the voice of the diaspora as a lever of pressure for the return, finally, of the stolen Parthenon sculptures in their home. The diaspora, the homogenia, will play a big role in that. We need the voice of the diaspora to pressure Turkey to stop questioning our sovereignty and our sovereign rights. And we need the voice of this diaspora to be expressed through the mail-in ballot of the European elections next June. As far as I'm concerned, having lived in both countries, I am determined to support this voice. It's a new situation for Greek politics to have an expat in today's digital, globalized world, to be here in the position of main opposition party leader, potential prime minister. But rest assured that together, as a global Greek community, we can achieve more rather than less for Greece. And ultimately, that's all that matters. Thank you very much.